I think we're having a few stragglers come in, but I'm going to start us off and introduce myself. Wow, I got huge. My name is Trevor Yokoyama. I'm based in Seattle, Washington. I'm the co-editor-in-chief of the Young Buddhist editorial, and we're pleased to put on this event with Ryland. For those of you, this is Mindfulness Through Poetry, Buddhism and Haiku, presented by Ryland Li. We will be recording the presentation and not the breakout rooms. We'll let everybody know, so just so everyone's comfortable with that. A couple of things to get through first. At YBE, we think it's important, so we'd like to begin this event with a land acknowledgement. So we would like to first acknowledge that the land we are on, if you're currently in the United States, is stolen land due to the forced removal of First Nations and Indigenous peoples. We want to frame our conversation today with this in mind, as it's important that we understand the history that has brought us to be here and to occupy this land and to seek our place within that history. Okay, and I see a lot of new faces as well, so I would also just like to briefly introduce YBE. Let's see, the Young Buddhist editorial was started in January of 2020, so just before the pandemic. It was started by a young group of Japanese American Jodo Shinshu Buddhists at the Seattle Betsuin Buddhist Temple. And we were started with the intention to create a space and platform for young Buddhists to foster growth, community, and interconnectedness while creating a dialogue between young Buddhists and other generations. Okay, now for the good stuff. I'm going to introduce Ryland. So, Ryland Li is a poet and environmental lawyer living in Northern Virginia of the United States of America. Poetry teaches Ryland how to pay attention and to see beauty and interdependence within all things. Ryland's work has been published in Frogpond, Modern Haiku, Brivens, Presence, and many other journals. He is a member of Towpath Haiku, which I believe quite a few members are joining us today, so thank you for that. And in his free time, Ryland enjoys being in nature, practicing mindfulness, meditation, and learning new things. So take it away.
Thanks, Trevor. It's great to be here. I'm going to share my slides. Everybody see that? Great. Well, as Trevor noted, you are all here tonight for a talk called Mindfulness Through Poetry, Haiku Buddhism, and I am your presenter, Ryland Li. Our talk will cover a variety of material. We'll start by talking about what are haiku, and then discussing the intersection between haiku and Buddhism, including principles like mindfulness, concentration, non-discrimination, and non-self. We'll have the opportunity to appreciate some classic Japanese haiku in translation, as well as modern English language haiku. We'll have the opportunity to try writing a haiku art to ourselves. And there will be time for Q&A at the end, but I'm also happy to take questions throughout, so feel free to raise your hand or put something in the chat if you have a question. Before we dive in further, I want to offer some acknowledgements. Tonight's event is made possible through many people, including foremost the team at Young Buddhist Editorial, including Trevor, who you just saw, Anna Tsumoto, Allison Tanaka, Casey Mukai, and Kevin Shen are all with us tonight. Thank you so much for all your work in putting this together. I also want to thank my friend and fellow poet, Matt Snyder, who is the one who shared the haiku activity with me that we'll be doing tonight, and who offered some very helpful comments on this presentation. I want to thank as well the poets whose work I have quoted, including at least one poet who I know is here tonight, Mary Stevens. Thank you very much, Mary. And finally, I want to thank all of you for spending this evening together with me to learn about haiku and Buddhism. Right. I'll start us off by sharing this haiku with you by Yosa Buson, who is one of the Japanese masters of haiku. I'll read it a couple of times and I invite you to just enjoy listening to it. Enjoy the sounds of the poem and the images. If you like, you can even close your eyes for a fuller experience. Coolness, the sound of the bell as it leaves the bell. Coolness, the sound of the bell as it leaves the bell. I hope you enjoyed that. So what is haiku? I know there's a bunch of you in the audience who are extremely familiar with what is haiku, and there's some of you who don't know anything about it. So at least for those in the latter group, we'll learn a little bit about what is haiku. So haiku is a form of poetry that originates from Japan. Traditionally, haiku contains 17 sound units, which are kind of like syllables in English, but also a little bit different. They include a word or phrase that indicates a season. So autumn, winter, spring, summer, or the New Year season. And they also have what's called a cut word, which is a word that separates the two parts of the haiku. And we'll see an example of all three of these things in the next slide. Haiku was originally called hokku, and it was the first verse of a multi-verse linked verse poem called a renga. So for instance, you might have a renga poem with 36 verses, and the first verse was called hokku, and that over time became what we today call haiku. Haiku can also be paired with prose, a prose essay, or with a painting to create what are called haibun and haiga, respectively. And finally, there's a related form to haiku called senryu, which traditionally also has 17 sound units, but it may lack that seasonal element and the cutting word. So here's an example of a haiku. This is perhaps the most famous haiku, or one of the most famous haiku from Japan. It's written by Matsuo Basho, who is considered the first great master of haiku in the 17th century. Old pond, a frog jumps in, the sound of water. Old pond, a frog jumps in, the sound of water. And I'll read it for you in Japanese as well, and you can pardon my foreign accent here. Furui ike ya kawazu tobikomu mizu no oto. Furui ike ya kawazu tobikomu mizu no oto. And so in the Japanese, this poem has the three elements that we discussed in the prior slides. There are 17 sound units in Furuikeya, and there is also a season word. And here the season word is frog, which is a word that indicates the spring season. There is also a cutting word here, which is the word ya, which follows furuikeya. And there's no translation for that in English. So instead we use the M dash following the word old pond, the phrase old pond. And on this slide, we see the same poem written in calligraphy and paired with a sumi painting of a frog next to a pond. And so this would be a haiga. And what about haiku in English? Well, it's only about a century old. Today, though, there is a lively and growing community, including many of the folks in our call today. And English language haiku are derived, but also distinct from Japanese haiku. And this is simply because English and Japanese are two very different languages. Haiku poems in English typically have fewer than 17 syllables. And this is largely due to the fact that English syllables can be much longer than sound units in Japanese. So most of the haiku that are published in English language haiku magazines have fewer than 17 syllables, despite what you might have learned in middle school about haiku being a 17-syllable poem. There are no cut words in English. We just don't have any words in our vocabulary that have that function. And so instead, in the English language, we use punctuation like em dashes or ellipses, as well as line breaks. And English language poets may also use different season words corresponding to the place where they live. So for instance, if you live in the desert in Southern California, then you will have very different seasons than they did in Japan, and therefore you might have quite different season words. Here's a poem by Ezra Pound, which is regarded as one of the earliest haiku in the English language and perhaps the most famous of the earliest haiku. And he gives it a title, which is unusual for haiku, but it's called In the Station of the Metro. The apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bow. In the station of the metro, the apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bow. And he wrote this in 1913. Fast forward to today, or to 2020 rather, and we have this wonderful haiku by Mary Stevens, who's with us today. The heft of a cast iron skillet, autumn deepens. The heft of a cast iron skillet, autumn deepens. So what is the connection between haiku and Buddhism? Well, there's a few different connections we can discuss. The first is that Buddhism was part of the cultural milieu in which haiku developed. Buddhism arrived in Japan over a millennia before Basho was writing haiku in the 6th century. And over time, it became one of the two major religions in Japan, along with Shinto. There were many famous haiku poets who were Buddhists, including Basho himself, who was a student of Zen and who almost became a Zen monk. And some other famous haiku poet Buddhists were Kobayashi Issa and Futa Chioni, both who were Shin Buddhists, and we'll hear some of their poetry later on. Now, of course, there are many haiku poets, both then and now, who are not Buddhists, and by no means do you have to be Buddhist to write a haiku, and nor are all haiku Buddhist in some more explicit sense, at least. However, I believe that haiku can be a spiritual path. It can be a way to mindfulness and insight. And I think it's a path that resonates especially well with Buddhist teachings, including teachings about being in this present moment with mindfulness and concentration, teachings about non-discrimination, and about non-self. And we'll look at each of these three teachings in the next group of slides and talk about some haiku that exemplify each one of them. So this present moment, concentration, mindfulness, and insight. And I have a helper tonight helping me to read this prose passages. So Allison, I'll let you take it from here.
Yeah, so do not pursue the past, do not lose yourself in the future. The past no longer is, the future has not yet come. Looking deeply at life as it is in the very here and now, the practitioner dwells in stability and freedom.
Thanks, Allison. And this excerpt is from the Sutta on Knowing the Better Way to Live Alone. This translation is by Thich Nhat Hanh. I will note here that I think all of the Buddhist kind of sutta excerpts and book excerpts here are by Thich Nhat Hanh. And I've used his work because I read it and I appreciate him very much. However, I don't believe there is anything here that's kind of unique to his tradition or Vietnamese Zen or Mahayana Buddhism in particular. And most of you probably don't even care about that, but for those of you who do, I did want to note that. And so in this sutta, the Buddha is talking about essentially, be here in the present moment, be awake to what you're feeling, what you're thinking, what you're doing right now. Don't be lost in your worries for the past or your anxieties for the future. But by being here in the present, you attain stability and freedom. And next we'll see an excerpt by Matsuo Basho, which talks about many of the same things. Allison, please go ahead.
One must first of all concentrate one's thoughts on an object. Once one's mind achieves a state of concentration and the space between oneself and the object has disappeared, the essential nature of the object can be perceived. Then express it immediately. If one ponders it, it will vanish from the mind.
Thank you. And so here Basho is talking about, I think, something very similar as what the sutta is saying, that in the process of writing haiku, focus on what's present right before you, on the object that's before you. And once you're one with that object, you're really concentrated on it, then you'll understand something about it. You'll have some insight into it. And from that, the poetry will flow from you. And of course, different haiku writers and different haiku are written using different processes, but I think what Basho is describing here is a way of writing haiku that many people employ, and I myself employ. And Allison, would you read this one as well?
The central act of haiku is letting an object or event touch us, and then sharing it with another. If we are the writer, we share it with the reader. If we read a haiku, we share that moment or one like it with the writer.
Thanks. And this excerpt is from the Haiku Handbook by Bill Higginson and Penny Harder, which is perhaps a leading manual of English language haiku. And here they're talking about something I think very similar to what Basho just mentioned, that the central act of haiku is being touched by something. It's accompanying something and really becoming invested in it. And then out of that feeling, out of that experience, words arise, which we can share with our readers. So now we'll go back to the first Basho poem that we read. Old pond, a frog jumps in, the sound of water. Now, I obviously wasn't there when Basho wrote this poem, and I wasn't able to interview him, but you can see just from how the poem turned out that he was probably doing what he said a couple of slides ago. You can imagine him walking or maybe sitting next to an old pond and hearing the sound of the frog jumping to the water, that little plop sound as the frog goes in. And out of that moment of keen perception, he writes this haiku. I'll also note that this haiku is special and interesting because in Japan at that time, as I think is probably true today, that frogs were known for the sound of their singing, for the sound of their calls. They're not really known for the sound of them falling into the water. And so he kind of focuses our attention on something that's less commonly thought of as being associated with frogs. That sound of them going into the water. And that's something that's special and interesting about this poem. And so the next time you're next to a body of water, perhaps, and you hear that little plop sound, maybe you'll think of Basho's poem. And here's another poem by Basho. Stillness, soaking into stones, cicadas cry. Stillness, soaking into stones, cicadas cry. And reading this poem, I get the sense that Basho was perhaps sitting in his hut, and one autumn evening he hears the cicadas cry. He hears it soaking into the world around it, and he feels the sense of stillness. Perhaps stillness in his heart, that he feels at peace, hearing the voices of the cicadas, or perhaps a stillness in that everything in the world is all right today because the cicadas are crying, just as they should be. In some ways, the word stillness is odd here because the cicadas can, of course, be very, very loud, and they cry for a very long time. But I imagine that as Basho was hearing the cicadas, he felt that stillness inside. That's what gave rise to this poem, or at least that's what this poem speaks to me. That's how this poem speaks to me. And here's our final poem in this set by Yosa Buson. Mist among grasses, silent waters, a day ends. Mist among grasses, silent waters, a day ends. And this poem has a very painterly feel to it, as though Buson was sitting outside and enjoying the end of the day and seeing the mist, the water, and being in the quietness. And out of that awareness of the present moment around him, he writes this poem. Right, and here's the second set of Buddhist teachings. We'll talk about non-discrimination between humans and non-humans, between living beings and non-living beings. And Alison, would you read this excerpt for us?
The fruit of the highest, most fulfilled awakened mind is realized through the practice of all wholesome actions in the spirit of non-self, non-person, non-living being, and non-lifespan. All composed things are like a dream, a phantom, a drop of dew, a flash of lightning.
Thanks, Alison. This excerpt is from the Diamond Sutra, and this is one of those pieces of text that you could talk about for 10 hours and not be done. But I'm including it here just for the purpose of kind of showing the principle of non-discrimination against things that are not persons and things that are not living beings. And explained more simply, it just means that we don't prioritize humans over non-humans or living beings over non-living beings in terms of their right to exist in this world, or in a sense, even in terms of whether they're worthy of our attention, whether they're worthy of writing a poem about, whether they're worthy of our kindness and protection. And we see the same spirit in many writings about haiku as well. And so here's a passage from Basho. And Alison, would you read this one? And then this continues into the next slide as well.
Learn about pines from the pine, and about bamboo from the bamboo. Make the universe your companion, always bearing in mind the true nature of things. Mountains and rivers trees and grasses and humanity, and enjoy the falling blossoms and the scattering leaves.
Thanks. And so here you have Basho saying something very similar, and perhaps in easier to understand terms in the Diamond Sutra, actually. He's saying that, in writing poetry and just in your life more generally, don't regard yourself as kind of lording it over the things in nature, but rather you're learning from them. In your writing in particular, you're learning from them, learning from the pines and the bamboo as to what they want to speak, and you speak that on their behalf. And you're making the things in nature your companion, your friend. You're seeking to understand their true nature and to enjoy them. And you can imagine him saying the same things about other people in your life. Be their companion, understand them, enjoy them. And we have the same sentiment, and I'll read this one from a book called the Kokinshu, which is a 10th century anthology of Japanese poetry. And so this predated haiku. And the Kokinshu says, listening to the voices of the warbler that sings in the flowers, or the frog that lives in the water, we ask, what of all living things does not create poetry? And so here the author of the Kokinshu is saying that even in this act of creating poetry, which we might think of as a fundamentally human act, in fact, the things of the natural world do it as well by singing, and in fact simply by being. Their lives are like a poem. Their songs are like a poem. And now we'll enjoy a few haiku by Kobayashi Issa, who was famous for writing haiku about animals, especially small animals, and empathizing with them. So this first poem, he says, don't swat. The fly rubs his hands, rubs his feet. Don't swat. The fly rubs his hands, rubs his feet. And the act of rubbing your hands kind of looks like the act of praying, somebody going to a temple and praying. And so he's saying here, look, this fly is engaged in some sacred activity, and it's praying twice, not only with its hands, but with its feet. So show it some mercy and don't swat. Our next poem, also by Issa. Dog sparkling with fireflies, sound asleep. Dog sparkling with fireflies, sound asleep. Here we have this beautiful image of the dogs, the fireflies, and a sense of peace of the dogs at rest. And in the poem, we get the sense of peace, and we also see that once again, Issa is writing about animals and about fireflies. So things that are not human, but he thinks these are also worthy of his attention as a poet. And here is the final poem by Issa. Spring breeze, the great courtier poops in the field. Spring breeze, the great courtier poops in the field. So this poem is a little bit different than the former two, and you can see Issa's kind of making fun of these this great, probably well-dressed courtier who is taking a crap out in the field, probably because he's traveling and there's no bathroom nearby. And how does this relate to non-discrimination? it relates to non-discrimination in the sense that he's saying, okay, even this kind of gross bodily function, which you might not think of as suitable for poetry, in fact, it is suitable for poetry. And in fact, I'm going to put it right next to the phrase spring breeze, which sounds very literary and poetic. Right. And we'll turn now to this third and last set of Buddhist teachings on non-self and interdependence. And Allison, if you could read the next 2 slides.
Looking into a flower, we can see that it is full of life. It contains soil, rain, and sunshine. It is also full of clouds, oceans, and minerals. It is even full of space and time. In fact, the whole cosmos is present in this one little flower. If we took out just one of these non-flower elements, the flower would not be there. The flower cannot exist by itself alone. We too are full of so many things, and yet empty of a separate self. Like the flower, we contain earth, water, air, sunlight, and warmth. We contain our ancestors, our parents and grandparents, education, food, and culture. The whole cosmos has come together to create the wonderful manifestation that we are. If we remove any of these non-us elements, we will find there is no us left.
Thank you, Allison. And so in this passage, Thich Nhat Hanh is talking about how all the things in this world are interconnected and nothing is fundamentally separate. That each one of us, we're made up of all these things that are not ourselves. At a physical level, the food that we eat, the water we drink, the air that we breathe, and in a more kind of mental, psychological sense, our memories, our experiences, the people in our lives. And this is true for everything in the cosmos, that it's interconnected with everything else. And we see this idea about interbeing expressed, maybe implied is the right word, but embodied in haiku. And if somebody is not on mute, please mute yourself. I think there's a little bit of background noise coming through. So here's another haiku by Basho. Autumn dusk. A crow settles on a bare branch. Autumn dusk. A crow settles on a bare branch. And you'll note that this haiku, like many of the ones we've read, has 2 parts. The autumn dusk, which is also called the fragment, and a crow settles on a bare branch, which is the phrase. And you also note that it's not written as in the autumn dusk, a crow settles on a bare branch. Right? Rather, the 2 parts are just separated by an M dash. And so what is the relationship between these 2 parts? Well, for one, you might think the autumn dusk is the time of year and time of day in which the crow is doing his thing here. And I think that's correct. That is part of the poem. But autumn dusk is much more than the backdrop for the crow's activity here. Autumn dusk itself signifies a lot of meanings. It signifies the setting of the sun, so the sun moving downward in the sky. It signifies the light from the sun weakening and dimming the weather growing colder, the coming of winter, the ending of summer, and even the end of life as plants in particular lose their leaves or die in anticipation of the winter. And all of these meanings kind of resonate with one another and with the activity of the crow. So the crow is settling, it's coming down on the branch, just like the sun is coming down. The branch, presumably it's late autumn, the branch is bare. And so it's a sign of the retreat of life. And the crow, despite often being a very loud bird, is not cawing in this poem. It's just settling and perhaps is doing so in a quiet way. And so you put these two pieces of the poem together, and the images and the meanings that they connote resonate with each other to form a greater whole. The sense of downward movement, the sense of quietness and stillness, of the end of day, the end of life, something that ripples through both parts of the poem and that weaves together into an integral whole once you have the poem that contains both parts. And this next poem is by Fukuda Chioni. Cool, clear water and fireflies that vanish. That is all there is. Cool, clear water and fireflies that vanish. That is all there is. So there's kind of three parts to this poem: the water, the vanishing fireflies, and this statement, you might call it, about things or about life. That is all there is. And you can imagine if you only had the first two lines, cool, clear water and fireflies that vanish, that you would have this beautiful image or beautiful couple of images, and maybe also this sense of loss with the vanishing fireflies. You could also imagine if you only had this last line of the poem by itself, that is all there is. It's kind of this, I don't know, philosophical statement about things. But you put them together and there is a whole that is greater than the sum of its parts. And there's a lot of meanings I think a reader could intuit in this poem. That what does it mean that that is all there is? Perhaps that's just what Chioni is seeing, like before her in the present moment when she wrote the poem. Perhaps she's saying that, well, this is kind of, that's all there is to life. That you have things in life that sustain you, like the cool, clear water. You have sources of beauty and of light and of activity, like the fireflies. And then you inevitably also have loss with the vanishing of the fireflies. So by putting these images together with this kind of more philosophical statement, you get this resonance that contributes to a greater whole. And our final poem in this section is by Ozaki Hosai, who's a more modern poet in the late 19th, early 20th century. And he writes, "Snow stops in the voices of children, the sun shines. Snow stops in the voices of children, the sun shines." And this poem, to me, presents an image of the snow having stopped and kids out in the streets playing, talking, yelling, just being happy. And their voices bring a sense of warmth to the community, to this poet, just as though the sun is shining. There's both a physical warmth and a emotional, psychological warmth. And these two sources of warmth and of joy are resonating with each other by their juxtaposition in this poem. And so going back to kind of the Thich Nhat Hanh excerpt, we see here that the sun is in the children, and the children are in the warmth of the sun, and their being, their existence is intertwined, and with the snow as well. All right, and now here's for the fun part of our talk tonight. We'll do a little exercise in groups of 2. In a little bit, Casey will put you all in breakout rooms, and we will be writing haiku. So one of you will write a 1-line fragment, so 1 to maybe 3 or 4 words, that has a seasonal element. One of you will write a 2-line phrase, which can be based on the observation of your daily life. And we'll have some more detailed instructions coming up soon. And then you'll put the fragment and the phrase together into a haiku. You can talk a little bit about the poem, and then you can switch roles, where the person who wrote the fragment will now write the phrase and vice versa. We'll spend about 15 minutes for the exercise. And Casey will give you a warning midway at about the 7-minute mark and towards the end. And then we can come back into the large group, and folks can share their poems and any reflections that you have on the exercise. So a little bit more detail on the instructions. So the first person will write a 1-line fragment, perhaps containing a seasonal element. That could be something related to the current season. And there's some examples here: morning cool, clear sky, autumn night, fall colors, migrating geese, Thanksgiving Day. You can obviously write more than 1 if you want. Second person will write a 2-line phrase, and could be a simple observation from your daily life. Maybe something that you did or experienced in the last week or so, when you felt particularly aware or interested in something. Here are some examples: reseasoning the cast iron, the sutra flutters in the breeze, yet another pile of paperwork, rearranging the flowers, opening the bag of Indian food. And so once you have your little phrase, which, if you follow the examples here, could be just a few words, maybe 3 to 8 words or a little bit more. You'll want to divide that phrase into 2 lines, kind of like what you see here. And maybe folks can take like just 2 or 3 minutes to do the writing. And then you can come together with your partner and put it together. So you'll get poems like this: migrating geese, yet another pile of paperwork, autumn night, opening the bag of Indian food, Thanksgiving Day, rearranging the flowers. And then you'll have a chance to talk about your poem. Here's some questions, a guided discussion. You don't have to go through all of these. The point is just to talk about the poem, how you felt about the process, and if you feel like the 2 parts of the poem, the fragment and phrase, resonate with each other and connect with the Buddhist teaching that things are fundamentally interconnected and not separate. And I will drop those into the chat right now so I don't forget. And that's basically it. So in some, one person writes a one-line fragment, the other person writes a two-line phrase. You put them together into a haiku, and then you talk about the poem. 15 minutes total, 7 minutes per round, and then you can switch in the middle. And maybe just take like a couple minutes to do the writing and then spend the rest of the time chatting. All right, so we'll have the chance to appreciate some modern haiku written in English. These are selected from the Haiku Foundation Touchstone Awards, which select haiku that have been published in the past year and give them an award. And in the interest of time, since we only have about 10 minutes left, I'm not going to do commentary on these, but we can still enjoy hearing them. First one is by Sasha Palmer. Beneath the blossoms, she counts her years in one hand. Beneath the blossom, she counts her years in one hand. I love this poem because of how open it is, that it could be a little girl, like a 5-year-old girl counting her age, or maybe an old lady counting down the years left in her life. That range of possibilities is embodied in the poem. Here's one of my favorite haiku of all time by Greg Wanamaker. Strawberry season, acres and acres of bent backs. Strawberry season, acres and acres of bent backs. Gives us this pastoral image of strawberry fields, and then it turns our attention to the hard, backbreaking labor of the workers who are harvesting the strawberries. And just 8 pretty short words, it captures a lot for me. The beauty of the fields, as well as the labor, the class divisions between those who harvest the strawberries and those who are buying them at the grocery store. Here's one by Joan Shrine. Rain-soaked earth, a robin ties one end of the universe. Rain-soaked earth, a robin ties one end of the universe. This poem for me really embodies that idea of interbeing, all things are interconnected, and that have I think of it as a worm that the worm is tugging, the worm that's in the soil that's made from the decaying plant life, animal life, and the plants that grow under the sunshine. So in the worm, you have the soil, the plants, the sunshine, and it's really the whole universe that the robin is tugging with. Here's one by Peter Newton. Middle age, I build the snowman in the sun. Middle age, I build the snowman in the sun. I love this poem for just how open it feels and how this simple image can lead me or just lead the reader to some deep emotions, perhaps ones of yearning for children and not having them, and therefore turning to this snowman child. All right, and here are some of mine. And I really won't do commentary this time, just so we can finish on time. Autumn nap, the occasional fuzz of an acorn. Autumn nap, the occasional fuzz of an acorn. After the move, the photos left in the box. After the move, the photos left in the box. Wheat harvest, bleeding together with the sparrows. wheat harvest, gleaning together in the paradise. This one was published through the Young Buddhist editorial. They were at their website on the first wonderful article is called about. So for those who haven't visited it, I commend that to you, youngbuddhisteditorial.com. Home building, mouthful by mouthful. Home building, mouthful by mouthful. All right, in our last couple of minutes here, where to go for more haiku. Half of you on this call have been writing haiku for much longer than I have, so you don't need this, but to share it with the rest of you. If you want to read a book about reading and writing haiku in English, I'd recommend the Haiku Handbook by Bill Higginson and Penny Carter. I think this is the best single book in the field for introducing haiku. If you're looking to read haiku that are being published by English Language Arts today, there are two great journals. Frogpond, which is a journal of the Haiku Society of America. It comes out in print, and the Heron's Nest. And actually both of these have poems online, which you can read for free with those links. I will also share a copy of the slides afterwards, so don't worry about taking down the links. And if you're looking for a community, I recommend you join a Haiku Society near you. There are Haiku Societies in many countries in the world, and most of us are in the US, so there's a Haiku Society of America. They have a lot of programs, including a program for folks under 40, a mentorship program where you're paired with several poets to write with and to learn from. And actually my mentorship program, Annette Montenegro, she's here today, and you heard her speak earlier, so hello there. There are also regional chapters where you can connect with those in the local area about haiku. And this beautiful book cover here is the anthology for the mentorship program. So if you join the program, you're guaranteed to get your work in print in next year's anthology. That takes us to the end. We have a couple minutes left. I welcome any questions folks have, and you're also very welcome to contact me via email at lee.ryland@gmail.com. So any final questions or thoughts folks want to share before we wrap up?
I just want to say thank you. It was really fun.
Thank you for being with us. Well, I know we're out of time, and I think I'm turning it back over to Casey for some final announcements.
Yeah, thanks so much, Ryland. Just wanted to say thank you all for attending. One sec. Okay, there we go. Thank you all for attending today's event. We hope that you all enjoyed it. And on behalf of YBE, I'd also like to extend our appreciation and thanks to Ryland for sharing his wisdom and poetry with us today. If everyone can just give him a round of applause, that'd be great. Yeah. So yeah, like Ryland said, we'll be sending out a follow-up email with the slide deck linked in, because I know that Ryland shared so many wonderful pieces with you today. So if you wanted to go back and read through those again, or access any of the resources that he had on the slides. We'll also have a recording of this event up on our YouTube channel shortly. So if you would like to share it with anyone who didn't get to make it today. If you would like to stay updated with YBE's activities, feel free to check out our website, which I'll put in the chat right now. Other than that, thank you so much for attending today's event. We hope you have a wonderful evening. And yeah, take care and be well. Thank you so much for attending.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.